Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's IANA webinar. Intermodal Connects is our theme, and Intermodal Analyze is our session today. We are back with Larry Gross, the Intermodalist, president and founder of Gross Transportation Consulting. Larry digs into the numbers, so we don't have to. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Larry. I'll drop off. I'll see you on the other side, Larry, with Q&A.
Thanks, Hal. As always, it's great to be with you and with the audience. This is one of the favorite things that I have a chance and an opportunity to do, and I'm very grateful to IANA for connecting me with all the folks that are on the other end of the webinar here. For those of you who want to reach out with perhaps questions that are not handled here during the hour that we have available, here's my email, my cell phone, and you can follow me on Twitter. I use the handle Intermodalist. So with that, let's jump in. We've got some ground to cover here. And so here is the March data. It's pretty well fresh off of the press. And I will say at the outset, you look at that jump from February to March, that is quite an attention getter. But a little bit of a spoiler here, there's a bit less here than meets the eye. But let's table that for just a minute and go through some basics here. As always, we divide the intermodal sector into two pieces: the domestic sector, which is on this chart in green, and the international or IPI sector, which is on the chart in blue. And we're distinguishing between those two by the type of equipment that's moving and not by the type of freight that's inside. We have no view of that, but IANA's ETSO database gives us an ability to sort of segment the market by equipment type, and that's what we're doing here. So the red and the green work off of the right-hand axis, the blue and the green, I beg your pardon. And then the red is the total intermodal activity for the month in terms of revenue movements, and that works off of the left-hand axis. So if we look at this table on the right, you can see the various segments and how they have performed of late. First column is the 2021 numbers versus prior year. The second column is now we're 3 months in. It's the first quarter and how intermodal has performed for the first quarter. And then the third column is the most recent month. And there are, I think, some pretty interesting nuggets buried in this table. The first and not particularly encouraging one is that intermodal as a whole has been in the red versus prior year for the entire first quarter. And that was true in March. We were down 5.5%, not quite as bad as it was before, but still, substantially negative. And that's due, as you can see, due to the international or IPI, inland point intermodal performance, which is down a very sizable 15.5% for the first quarter and just a little bit better than that in March. The news is considerably better on the domestic side. We're in the black to the tune of about a little less than 3% for the first quarter, and that's encouraging relative to where things had been. And of course, it's domestic container that's providing the horsepower there, because the QFC side, which is the last line, is going down as a result of conversion. The other thing I'll point out is the tremendous differential that's occurring right now between the private domestic container fleet and the rail domestic container fleet. Rail was down 4.4% year over year in March, whereas the privates were up a very sizable 10%. And that is a function of all of the new boxes that are flowing in, a lot of new capacity entering into the private domestic container arena. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. So I mentioned that I thought that this chart with the startling rise in March was a bit misleading. And here's what I'm referring to there, and that is the importance for all of us to understanding the calendar effects. And for those of you who do it, this is not a Wordle exercise here, the new online game craze, which looks like this, but rather what we're trying to do here is illustrate the number of working days that were in February versus March. And you can see there were roughly 3 more working days in March than in February. And so what that means is that you need to see an increase from February to March of over 14%, 3 days versus 21, in order for things just to stay even. So when we look at month-to-month numbers, sometimes they can be wildly either exaggerated or underreporting what's actually going on, depending on what's happening with the working days. And I say roughly 3 more working days because actually the discussion is a bit more nuanced even than that, because a Friday in terms of intermodal activity is worth more than a Monday. And we try and actually account for all of that in our calculations, as well as holidays and such. So it's quite a complex, but I think important calculation for us to make. And that's illustrated now by this, which is the same data that we saw on the monthly chart, but adjusted for working days. And it gives us a much different view of what's been happening recently. If you look at the blue line, the international line, what this shows is a pretty steady, slow recovery that actually started in January. Working revenue moves per working day have been working their way upward slowly. I would say, to my eye, a little bit of a lessening of the improvement as we went on. Big improvement in January, little less in February, little bit less in March. On the domestic side, it took another month before we started to see an uptick, but now we are seeing a pretty decent uptick for 2 months now, and back up to the level that we were back in the fourth quarter of last year. On the international side, even though we've seen some sequential improvement, we are nowhere near where we were back this time last year. So we're in a very, very deep hole in terms of the IPI sector. What this chart does is puts it in a little bit more of a context. If we set the volume that occurred in 2015 as an average of 100, where are we now? And we are comparing the various key intermodal equipment types versus truck. And what you can see here is that in particular, most of the growth has been on the private domestic container side. Here in green is the overall domestic intermodal numbers. And what you can see here is that starting in 2019, not coincidentally, at the start of the PSR revolution or evolution, domestic intermodal has been underperforming relative to truck. And that's quite significant, particularly in recent quarters. And truck is up about 25% from where it was on the average in 2015. But domestic intermodal is only up about 7%. The only area of intermodal that comes close is private domestic container, which was outgrowing truck until we reached the capacity limitations here during the surge, and which point truck overtook it. Here's the trailer number, and of course that's deeply in the red, and we expect it to remain so. Here's the latest AAR data, which now is reaching into the middle of April. And I'd say the message here is mildly encouraging. We are seeing a slow ramping up of volume. This dark black line is the weekly numbers. The lighter gray line is the 4-week moving average, which tends to remove such things or minimize holiday effects and such. And we're seeing a very sort of stately kind of a slow improvement there. I don't read anything into this last little dip that we saw last week, because that was the presence of Good Friday, which reduced, in my opinion, the weekly volumes. And we also saw a jump up in the year-over-year deficit. But again, I think that's a holiday effect, because if you look at when Good Friday was in 2021, it wasn't in week 15, which is the number week that we are in most recently. It was in week 13. So that means that this year-over-year deficit here is probably a little bit exaggerated. And I expect to see a return to the kind of pattern when the numbers come out tomorrow. And we'll be putting our normal flash update out for those of you who are subscribers, and we'll be covering that. There is, I'll say, some very measured good news on the market share front. Now that we have 3 months under our belt, the first quarter, we're able to take a look at intermodal market share, and we are seeing a modest rebound in the domestic share versus long haul truck. And what we're measuring here is the amount of intermodal participation versus a truckload, dry van, and reefer moves of 500 miles or more. So Market share here bottomed out in the third quarter, and since then we've seen some recovery, not a tremendous amount of recovery when you compare it with where it was back in the 2019 timeframe before things started to get warped by the pandemic. No such good news on the IPI side. The only thing that you could characterize as good news is the plunge has stopped and we've been stable now for 2 quarters. So far in the fourth quarter of 2020 and the first quarter of 2021, a stable number at a very low level. I do expect, I think, to start to see some recovery there, but it's going to be, based on what I'm seeing right now, a pretty slow and painful process. We talked about this a little bit at the outset, what's happening with regard to domestic containers. What we're measuring here on the left is the amount of domestic container revenue moves per working day for the different months. And you can see that the private side, which is this dark green line, roughly 2/3, now an increasing number of domestic containers are privately owned. And there's been a general upward trend, although we did see a little bit of a retrenchment here in January, but upward movement has resumed here as we've gone through February and March. A much more muted situation here on the rail side, the EMPs, the UMAXs, etc. Not really any signs of growth, a little bit of a recovery here. And one would normally expect in a normal year, January to be kind of a quiet month, February too, for that matter, from a normal seasonal perspective. So, I don't read a lot into this January dip necessarily, but we're just not really seeing the kind of increases on the rail side that we're seeing on the private side. And that is made clear here by this chart, which shows what is the share of domestic container revenue moves per month that's being generated by the private fleet versus the rail fleet. And that is an extremely clear trend here, which just shows that private share heading pretty well northward with some puts and takes on various months, but the underlying trend is shown here by this black line is crystal clear. And I don't really expect to see any change in that going forward. Now, we had some good news. Now we'll talk about some not so good news. The service picture right now is looking pretty difficult. I don't oversell the value of these SDB statistics. They are, as I put it in my recent Journal of Commerce column, a candle in a dark room, but it beats stumbling around in the pitch black. There's a little bit of value to these numbers. They tell us a little bit about what's happening, at least with regard to the rail network. And we're seeing there's ample news in the headlines in the news about the deterioration in rail service. In fact, I believe even as we speak here, the various railroad CEOs are going to be testifying here today and tomorrow in front of the STB, who is very concerned about the level of service that's being delivered right now. Here we see the average intermodal train speeds on a 4-week moving average basis for the entire intermodal network, US intermodal network, and we're down in the basement here, as you can see on this red line, which is the 2022 performance to date. It is well below the average performance of the last 5 years, and in fact, for this week, probably the lowest that we've seen for this week of the year. Normally, we would start to see, there's some seasonal aspects to this, we'd start to see some improvement. We're not seeing it this year. The other two measures that the STB provides are the number of intermodal trains that are being held for various reasons. There are 3 buckets here. One is being held for lack of power, lack of locomotives. The second is lack of crews. And the third is an all other bucket. And based on what the railroads are saying, the big issue here at the moment is lack of crews for intermodal trains and lack of crews for all the other trains that they're operating. And that's also having an effect, which we can see in the number of loaded intermodal cars that haven't moved for 48 hours or more. And both of these measures are kind of at stratospheric levels, well above anything that is in the recent past normal situation. This one is, I believe, at a record. This one is obviously not quite as bad as it was in 2021, The difference here being that this was a product of weather disruptions and such during the polar vortex, whereas this is just the inability of the network to provide the kind of service that the volume is requesting. Another area that's, I'll say, troublesome to say the least is the drayage sector. We have our measure that we do for Intermodal In-Depth in conjunction with our good friend Jason Hilsenbeck at drayage.com and loadmatch.com, where we're measuring the number of clicks of folks looking for drayage capacity, with 100 being normal. Over the 3 years from 2015 through 2018, the average number of clicks for 21 individual markets was set at an index of 100. So anything above 200 normally is considered tight, and anything above 300 is extraordinarily tight. And here we are easing down off of the 700 range into the 600 range. So this market is still heavily impaired, kind of dysfunctional, and in a bit of a state of meltdown, as it has been for the better part of a year. And some of the markets, as particularly the coastal markets, the port markets, are in a state of disarray. One poster child for that right now is the New York, New Jersey market, which is most recently showing a click level of about 1,300. So you don't even know what to do with those kind of numbers. They're so high. LA Long Beach is not nearly as bad. Won't say it's half as bad, because I don't think this scale really works that way, but 636 is still really bad, but not, at least you can see that there has been some improvement from where things stood in the latter part of last year. We've seen a lot of discussion about what's happening at the inland locations, and it appears that the problem is mostly in the terminals and chassis availability. Drayage situation, while tight at 238 for Chicago, is not extraordinary. And so, it looks relatively placid relative to what's happening in most of the port regions right now. So there is definitely some differences depending on where you're looking. We have a little bit of good news, I think, with regard to the port situation, and in particular, the ports out west. We've seen some improvement in throughput of imports. Unlike normal, these measures are not a measure of demand, because with ships stacked up, queued up, but waiting to be unloaded at every port, what the number of imports that we see per month is really a function just of how well that port is performing operationally and how successful they are at unloading and processing inbound containers. And the news here is that they seem to be getting more effective. Volume has been moving up steadily per month. Now, again, probably some of this improvement that we're seeing here in March is calendar effect, but nonetheless, it does look like things are heading in the right direction with regard to the ability of the ports to process. Now, I guess one point that I'll make here is that there's been a lot of discussion of how disruptive the lockdowns in Shanghai and in China are going to be with regard to the North American supply chain situation. And I am somewhat of an outlier in saying that, at least insofar as containerized volume is concerned, I think for the moment it's a non-issue, because we're not going to see any effects of a lockdown in Shanghai here in the North American intermodal system until the ship queues are gone. All what Shanghai is going to affect is, when does the next ship enter the queue? And so we're going to get a window here, an extended window, for the ports to work those queues down before the anticipated wave of Shanghai volume washes up against our shores once the Shanghai situation rectifies. But the only time that we will start to see actual effects here in the States is if the ports are successful in actually working the queues down to zero. Because then if the ship is delayed, we're going to actually lose capacity, lose throughput that won't be able to be recovered. But as long as the queues are there, the ports will continue to work at their maximum speed as they are now. And I don't think we'll see that much effect, if any. On the East has been running at a very high level consistently, well ahead of last year. We saw a little bit of a retrenchment in February, but again, I think what's happening here in February, March is mostly calendar effect. And in all cases here, I think the ports are getting much more cognizant of the necessity to meter the inbound volume. That's one reason why we see these queues extending, is because the ports have realized the importance of keeping their operations relatively fluid. And so they're not going to allow a wave of inbound ships to overwhelm the facility. And instead, they're going to mandate a metering of the inbound ships in order to keep the throughput going. So I think that's actually a good news situation. When we see these queues extending out a little bit, it just says that the ports are doing a better job at managing their situation and are not going to let it get overwhelmed like it was early in the pandemic surge. Now, we've seen a lot in the press here of late regarding the tick up in IPI and how that is creating congestion issues at the Midwest locations. And we have shortages of chassis and folks having to go back to the ground in wheeled facilities because they don't have enough chassis. And here again, this revenue moves per working day number, I think, is very useful, because what this chart shows us is that while we've seen an increase in the IPI moves, this is from the Southwest region to the Midwest region. This is one-way eastbound moves, basically LA to Chicago and other Midwestern points that are within the IANA ETSO Midwest region. We've seen, starting in November of last year, the green line here is 2021. We've seen an uptick. It went up from 22,000 to basically 2,200 to 2,400 to 2,700. That's a pretty decent increase. Came back down again here in March. But we are nowhere near recently where we were even as recently as a year ago. So the system is having difficulty digesting volumes that are considerably lower than what has historically been the norm. And this is just an indication of how impaired the system is right now versus I'll say, what used to be normal. And here's a similar chart. What we're tracking here is just all of the, well, this is Northwest to Midwest on the theory that perhaps we were seeing volume arriving from other West Coast locations. And, and it's really not the case either. We see a substantial gap here between this year's performance and last year's performance. So I conclude that the IPI network here right now is still extremely fragile. We saw revenue moves per day increase 8%, but we're still 14% below where we were prior year. So as we talk about when are things going to get back to normal, the absolute prerequisite is that the system needs to be able to handle, from an operational standpoint, normal volume in order to get volume back to normal. And we're just not there yet. So I think that until we start to see some more fluidity and we get more of a normalization of the chassis situation at these inland locations, we just cannot expect IPI to get back to where it was. And so this situation is informing my forecast with regard to at least the international side of intermodal and its ability to get back to some kind of a semblance of normalcy. It's going to be a tough struggle, I think, is the message here. Now let's talk a little bit about what's going on the domestic side. We talked already about the differential that we're seeing between what's happening on the private domestic container fleet and what's happening on the rail domestic container fleet. We have growth on the private side and a slump on the rail side. We are seeing a tremendous influx of new private domestic containers between 2021 and 2022, something like 55,000 new boxes. And that is an increase, a double-digit increase in private domestic container capacity, at least insofar as boxes are concerned. So what's driving all this? Well, there's a bunch of things that are driving it. One is growth of the traditional private intermodal integrated carriers. A second is the entry of new participants. So on the BCO side, Amazon and Walmart, who are both planning to build extensive fleets of their own boxes, and we're already seeing those flowing in. The third is TOFC conversion. We're certainly seeing substantial amounts of new reefers coming in against traditional 53-foot reefer trailer operators. They're being, I'll say, incented or coerced into converting to the domestic containers, which have less capacity, both in terms of weight and in terms of cube than the 53-foot trailer, but offer the advantages of the double stacking economies. And we're seeing also conversion to domestic container of LTL and parcel operators who love to operate 28-foot pup containers, as well as pup trailers, as well as 53-foot trailers. And now these are also being converted over to a certain extent to 53s, and those are all private fleets. But I think one of the things that is happening here is that we're seeing a lot of sort of market share in play. There's the market share shift that may be occurring right now between the rail box fleet and the private box fleet. And that's also inherently a shift between IMC, non-asset IMCs, and integrated operators. We're also seeing a lot of migration of private fleets from one railroad to the other out west. We've seen APL Logistics and Schneider and Swift moving over from BNSF to UP, which creates a much simpler situation, I think, over on the BNSF side. And between BNSF and JB Hunt, we've seen some aggressive plans being advertised to grow their fleet and their participation. And then you have over on the UP side, the various private operators, including Hub, who will all be scrapping for market share. And one of the requirements to gain market share is to have capacity. So there's a lot of new capacity coming in. And frankly, I am a little bit concerned about the ability to make use of all of this capacity. And the other piece that we haven't talked about here is equipment cycle times. And there's no question that the equipment cycle times on domestic containers have substantially stretched out. And we can measure that simply by looking at the estimated size of the fleet versus the amount of loads that fleet is producing. And that those numbers have come down from somewhere in the vicinity of perhaps 2 loads per box per month down to more like 1.75, or even a little lower, depending on when you're looking. If you think about that, then essentially what is needed is new boxes simply to make up for the deficit that these extended cycle times have created. Because what these cycle times have done is basically burn up capacity. The converse of that is true, however, that if we start to see some return to, again, normalcy, I put those terms in quotes, air quotes, because we don't really know what normal is these days, but any sort of improvement in cycle time is going to generate capacity out of thin air. So that will be additional capacity that comes on stream essentially over and above this level of new private boxes that are being introduced. And I do expect, as we start to get the service situation under control and some of the dislocations that persist from the pandemic surge and the supply chain disruptions are going to abate. I'm not saying they are going to abate quickly, but they will abate. We'll start to see some improvement in that cycle time, and that's going to generate more capacity. So that is one part of the picture here. And of course, we are seeing, I think, as I mentioned here in the third bullet point, some of the offset here is just that we're not really seeing any investment in the rail fleet. We think that the rail fleet actually edged down a little bit. If we look at the demographics of the existing domestic container fleet, and we use a rule of thumb that the container is good for a useful life of about 20 years, there are beginning to be a substantial number of units, domestic containers, that are going to start aging out of the fleet. And those old aged containers are concentrated in the rail fleet because the rail fleet got going earlier in time than the private fleets did for the most part. So we may see, I think, some continued shift here unless we start to see some substantial investment on the part of the rail fleet. Some of these additional new private boxes will essentially be boxes that are replacing rail fleet boxes that are being retired. And when we talk about capacity, we need to remember, and this is the fourth point here, there are all different pieces of capacity here. We talk about box capacity, but what about rail terminal capacity? What about the ability of the terminals who are currently already under strain to accept all of this additional equipment? And are they going to get bogged down, as we have seen the ports get bogged down, just simply by the volume that we're trying to squeeze through these facilities? And a third area of capacity is chassis capacity. And particularly on the domestic side, we've got a fairly limited number of chassis players, but the situation right now is manufacturing limited. A chassis is basically good for 45 years, assuming one does a heavy rebuild at about the 25-year standpoint. So we're not in a similar situation with regard to the chassis where equipment is beginning to age out. The 53-foot chassis fleet has a long way to go before we start to see the first age-related retirements. We do need to see some of these units getting rebuilt, but we need additional capacity, a chassis capacity, to match this growth in the private box fleet. And the ability of the domestic chassis manufacturers to meet this need right now is a little bit limited, because we saw back a little more than a year ago, the US International Trade Commission putting a punitive tariff on against Chinese manufactured chassis that were being imported, would be due to the judgment that the Chinese manufacturers were dumping their equipment into the US market. And so their punitive tariffs have basically made the Chinese originating equipment uneconomical. And it has fallen to the domestic chassis manufacturers to pick up the pace. And they've had as much difficulty as everybody else with regard to the supply chain and manpower shortages of workforce, et cetera. And it has impaired their ability to ramp up. So chassis availability is probably going to be one of the pacing items in terms of the kind of growth that we're going to be able to support here with regard to domestic container fleet. And then the other wild card here is how fast the railroads are going to continue to force conversion from trailer. And that takes the form of both lanes that are being eliminated, trailer lanes that are being eliminated, terminals that are being eliminated, and pricing differentials between 2FC and 53-foot container. So where does this all take us? I think IPI is eventually going to turn positive. I would say this is, given what I'm seeing right now, perhaps a bit of an optimistic viewpoint, but we need to keep in mind that anytime we look at year-over-year differences, that we really need to watch two things. One is what's happening right now, and the other is what was going on a year ago. And it's a fairly low bar for IPI to turn positive versus prior year in Q3, simply because that's when the plunge started last year. So the comparisons are going to get much, much easier when we get to Q3 and certainly when we get to Q4. But based on my viewpoint, we probably won't have enough of a gain here in the latter half of the year to fully offset the losses that we're going to see here in first quarter and second quarter. So I suspect that on a full year basis, IPI will still be negative. The domestic side, I think we're going to see a much more normal looking year. We'll actually see some seasonality this year. We haven't seen that, I don't think, since the pandemic started. We haven't seen a normal year from a seasonal perspective. So we'll start, I think as this equipment flows through, we'll start to see a ramp up, and I certainly will see something that looks a little bit more normal and a little bit more peaky this year than last, assuming that we don't see recession. We are seeing some signs of softness on the domestic side, particularly in truck spot pricing. I think there are folks that are talking about a trucking bloodbath and a trucking apocalypse. These tend to be sort of more alarmist than is necessary, and perhaps an attempt to create a sense of alarm in the interest of selling subscriptions. We are going to see some softening, and it's going to feel a lot worse than it should, simply because we're seeing softening from a very high level. And there'll be some echoes, I think, of 2019 and what we see here in 2022. But it's not going to be a bloodbath unless things really change. And we're going to see, I think we are already seeing quite a disconnect between what's happening on the ocean side and what will be happening domestically. We need to remember as intermodal folks that while our world is fairly dominated by the import-export side, perhaps 60% or plus of what we're doing is tied to import-export. When you look at the total US or North American freight transportation market, it's overwhelmingly domestic and not import-export. So there's a bit of a disconnect that's happening right now, but over time, that can't persist. Ultimately, those two pieces will align. And my guess is that international is going to start looking a lot more like domestic and not vice versa. We already, I think, have talked about the domestic container situation. So here's my always self-promotional, shameless self-promotion. We do cover this in excruciating detail for those of you who will really want to get down and understand this on an ongoing basis in the monthly report that we put out, Intermodal In-Depth. And this, in addition, we get the weekly flash updates that we put out when the AAR numbers come out. So we would love to get some of you added to our subscriber family. And if you have an interest, go to intermodalindepth.com. And the other thing that I'll mention before I turn it back to Hal is the Intermodal Volume Analyzer. The Intermodal Volume Analyzer is a distillation of the IANA ETSO data in a user-friendly form. Actually, that's what I use to produce those Southwest to Midwest charts that I showed you earlier for IPI. And for those of you who want to have an understanding and a control over what they're looking at with regard to the intermodal picture on a region-to-region basis, it's an excellent and easy-to-use tool. And you go head on over to intermodal.org, and Hal will be glad to sell you a subscription to that valuable asset as well. So with that, Hal, let me turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Larry. Great stuff. Thanks for keeping us advised on this. We've got some great questions. One of them, and I want to dip into this one because one of our attendees says that we missed slide 20. And they want to know, did we miss any of your analysis? Because they want to get every little bit. So I just wanted to dip back to that and just draw that to our attention.
So, okay. So this is the same kind of analysis. And all we're doing here, this is just reinforcing the point. What we're measuring here is the volume, the IPI volume that's coming out of the Southwest region going everywhere east of the Rockies. So this would be every South Central, which is Dallas, Midwest, Northeast, Eastern Canada, Southeast, everywhere. And the message is the same here in terms of the current IPI activity versus where we were a year ago. There's a substantial gap. In fact, we'll just do a quick calculation here. The overall gap is 25%. 25% lower in March of this year versus March of last year. So thank you for pointing that out. I claim technical incompetence.
Thanks, Larry, and thanks to that viewer that pointed that out to us. We appreciate it. We've got a lot of questions around the rail-owned domestic container fleet. There's any number of them, but I think we can probably have a kind of an ongoing discussion about it. But one of these sort of puts to the point of, so if the rail controlled domestic containers have dropped by the 2,500 units that you point out, do you have a sense of what the actual year-on-year percentage decline from the full rail controlled fleet is?
I do, not something that I have at the tip of my tongue. You know what, Hal? Go ahead and ask another question. In the meantime, I'll try and multitask here.
Well, I'll get.
It's a small percentage. And
I've got there's an interesting one here. That's sort of a philosophical question. Do the rails need to maintain a fleet of boxes?
That is well, my answer is that there needs to be, I believe, an intermodal channel, a source for the IMCs and the non-asset players to get capacity, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a railroad. I think it's very important for the industry that a source for that channel be maintained. Now, if you're an IMC that's running on BNSF, well, there are no rail-owned containers there, but there are certainly, there's availability. There's people like COFC Logistics and such that provide capacity to those IMCs who want to use BNSF. And, you know, the situation is in a real state of flux. I think, you know, an interesting potential is maybe Amazon becomes a source of capacity for that fleet. We've certainly seen them do that in other arenas. Of course, I have no idea what the contracts look like between Amazon and their underlying carriers and whether they have the ability to do that. But I think that in the age of PSR, the willingness of the railroads and the need for the railroads to continue to invest in that equipment is a bit on the bubble. You look at the performance of the rail fleet, and it's not as, you know, by various metrics, including productivity, balance, etc. It's not as well controlled as the private fleets. So, you know, the private fleets tend to be a more efficient option, and the marketplace has a way of expressing itself through things like that. So, so I guess the long-winded answer, but my conclusion is no, it doesn't have to be the railroads that provide that equipment.
Yeah, I mean, we're certainly seeing a lot of members adding to their controlled domestic boxes. You know, we spoke to an Alberta-based motor carrier slash, you know, sort of logistics provider this morning, and they're adding to their domestically controlled fleets there as well.
It's becoming very difficult to sort of size the domestic container fleet because the number of players, we don't know how many containers are being imported. There's no reporting on that. And not surprisingly, the Chinese manufacturers are not willing to share their numbers. So the only way to do it is to do it on the receiving end and survey all of the various carriers that are operating equipment individually and say, what are you doing this year? What did you do last year? And that task is becoming monumental because there are so many different players that are entering the field. Maybe, Hal, a good thing for IANA to think about.
For sure, yeah. I mean, it's interesting. It's almost the converse of the consolidation in the ISO side of the world. We've got an explosion of providers in the domestic side of the world. Very interesting. And you're right. We could probably talk for another hour about that and the ins and outs of it. I will kind of riff on it a little bit. We've got a great question here around reefer containers, and you know, what does the current investment in reefer containers look like? And do you have any insights into, you know, the trajectory for reefers, as well as any particular lanes that they're operating in that you see anything interest?
I think that the lifetime of the intermodal reefer trailer is limited, as is the case for all TOFC. I still expect that we're going to see an eventual complete transformation to a domestic container centric intermodal system, and you'll only have specialty trailer situations left, things like the remnant of Triple Crown or what the FEC is doing in Florida. But by and large, it's going to be 100% domestic container, just like it already is in Canada and Mexico. So if a carrier is going to use intermodal for temperature controlled services, it's going to be in a reefer domestic container, because that's the only way that they're going to be able to gain access to the system. And where is that stuff going to move? Well, it's going to tend to move where perishables move and where temperature control moves. A lot of east-west out of California, coming out of perhaps Mexico, north, south on the I-95, etc.
Mhm. Yeah, and to add to that, as our friends pointed out this morning, there's a percentage of the fleet that operates north of the border that's heated. So that's a sort of an interesting aspect that we haven't historically taken into account, but that continues to grow. And here's maybe we'll wrap up on this particular tack with just one more question around. And you just touched on it, but just sort of, what's your expectation for when, if trailer and fat car will entirely be phased out of the market in favor of just domestic containers?
My guess is 4 years, but it's entirely up to the railroads. I do believe that when the conversion happens, there is quite a substantial portion of the traffic that's currently in 2FC will not convert and will go back to the highway. So for the railroads, it's going to be a balancing calculation of the benefits that are going to be generated in terms of simpler operations and not, doing away with mixed terminals, etc., versus the traffic that they're going to lose. And if you have, for instance, an example is that these parcel and LTL carriers that use 28-foot pup trailers, which are not particularly great for intermodal because they chew up the same amount of terminal capacity, lift capacity, car capacity. But when you have a 28-foot trailer, it enables you to skip a sort and build a direct load in a smaller quantity to a secondary location. If you have a 53-foot container, then you're going to have to go in at a major point and resort, and that's expensive. So some of that 28-foot pup volume is going to stay in 28-foot pups, and they'll be just running as doubles down the highway instead of on the railroad. Not all of the trailer volume is going to convert.
Unless somebody has a bright idea of buying up a bunch of 20-footers and just keeping them domestically.
Well, UPS tried fit 28-foot containers back in the early days, and they ended up welding them to the chassis.
Yeah. In terms of, and here's another great question from one of our more philosophical viewers today, because and this is it touches on this notion of supply chain and the fact that when you completely fill up all of the berths and all of the slots and all of the cars and the chassis across the network, it's very difficult to push more freight through it. So the question is, how important is rail service when intermodal service is at its current level? Like when we're peaked out? I mean, is train speed a critical factor when there's no place for the goods on those trains to go once they get there?
The quick answer is speed is not critical. What's critical is reliability. And the value of the speed number is that when you see the speeds going down, it's basically a surrogate for a lack of consistency. And there's a very good correlation between when speeds decline and on-time train operations go down. So we just don't have any data that objectively captures that. That's why we look at the speed numbers, because that's what we have. On a broader sense, with regard to service, we're coming out of a period where capacity was king. And no matter which mode you wanted to use, you were in a capacity limited situation. So all what you had to have was a box available to load, and you would load it. Well, now we're not going to be in that situation shortly on the trucking side. That situation is loosening up. Demand is still strong. But if somebody wants to find a truck, they're going to be able to find a truck. So it's not going to be a situation where volume is being forced into the intermodal arena simply in search of capacity. And intermodal is going to have to earn its keep the old-fashioned way by delivering a desirable package, which is a combination of adequate service and cost savings versus truck. And to the extent that they're able to do that, intermodal is going to prosper in this coming years. If service continues to be difficult and we don't see the kind of reliability that I'll say is the minimum level that's required to compete effectively with truck, then we're going to have a tougher time.
would it make sense for high-speed rail taking boxes away from ports? So basically spiriting them into the hinterland and then parsing out the loads and redistributing them. If our friend Ted is on, he's got a paper on that very topic.
I'm in agreement with Ted on not the high-speed rail, but using rail to evacuate containers from the ports and consolidating and mixing them at an inland location where you have lots of room to work, particularly with regard to California, to Southern California, makes tons of sense. I had a chance to visit the Pacific Harbor lines when I was out at the TPM here a couple of months ago, and the task that they have to do to put together PSR-sized trains out of on-dock facilities in LA Long Beach with the alliances all carrying different lines of containers on a single ship, it's monumental. I have no idea actually how they do it. And that situation could be dramatically simplified if you just ran everything out to an inland location and did all of the sorting and train building out there. And it would also have a tremendous benefit if that facility was located in the Inland Empire somewhere where transloading volume could leave the terminal by rail instead of through the gate and going across all of the LA interstate highway system to get to the transloading facility, and instead just do a short haul shuttle move to get it close to where it needs to get to on the rail. So I think that would make tons of sense to have that kind of facility if it could be pulled off.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think maybe we'll have to do maybe a special edition of intermodal hardware for the future to kind of cover a lot of those questions. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Got a ton of questions left, and my apologies to those folks for not being able to get to all of them. But thanks for hanging in there with us. Great questions, everyone. Larry, thank you for wrestling with some of those. I will say this, a lot of the data that Larry works with comes from our ETSO database. And he does use the volume analyzer actually to generate a lot of the in-depth analysis that he does on that data. There's more information about those tools as well as other data information over at intermodal.org, and then go to data and statistics. Across, hit that, go down. You can also just send us an email at info@intermodal.org. We are always happy to hear from you. And if you've got any questions about this episode or any other topic, go ahead and hit us up, info@intermodal.org, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can with the information that you're looking for. Answer your questions, what have you. With that, I would like to thank Larry for his work. I would like to thank you all for joining us today on this episode of Intermodal Analyze, brought to you by IANA, the connecting force behind intermodal freight.